I think I only have to say that once today. Okay. Yeah, it's a great pleasure to welcome back here today's speaker to help us understand the extremism that has unnerved our society in recent times. Perhaps we Americans lived in a bubble of unreal innocence before 9/11, while in some parts of the world, extremism and terrorism were all too familiar already. How our lives and our vocabulary has changed. Extremism, radicalization, and terrorism of both the domestic and international kinds are with us every day. And while we're not formally at war and haven't been for a number of years, the experience of living at a time of terrorist attacks on civilians have made anxiety, suspicion, and fear our norm. The program on extremism at George Washington University was founded several years ago. Its research and findings give us a better understanding of surprise violence against others, often innocent people, including children, and why this culture, if you can call it that, attracts people to it. Today we will be discussing specifically why it attracts Americans. Alex Hitchens, you will recall, is the research director of the GW program. Prior to that, he was head of research for the study of radicalization at King's College London. Please welcome Alex back.
Thanks very much, Sandra, and thanks again for having me. It's a pleasure to be back, and I recognize a few faces from last time, so thanks for coming back. So Sandra asked me to come this time round. Last time I was here, I talked a little bit about the IS, Islamic State presence in the United States, how they recruit, how they operate, and the kind of general level of the threat, and what's being done about it. And then since then, we've done a sort of study looking a bit outside now, still looking at Americans and IS, but looking specifically at those Americans who left the United States since 2011 to join jihadist organizations in Syria or Iraq involved with either the Syrian civil war or the IS presence in Iraq and its effort against the Iraqi government. And so today I wanted to kind of present some of those findings of the report. This is the front cover of it. It's available on our website as well. That's extremism.gwu.edu online, and this is a PDF. And just a little bit about sort of how we gather the data for it. It's based on 64 Americans who we know who traveled to Syria, Iraq, and who we were able to identify by name. So that's the biggest number of identifiable individuals that's publicly out there that we were able to identify. There's likely to be at least another 100, if not more, maybe 150, but the government has not actually released information on how many exactly traveled, let alone on their names. So we had to kind of do our own work on identifying them. And how did we do that? A few different ways. A lot of interviews with various echelons of the U.S. law enforcement, including the FBI and various local police departments, also Department of Justice, Department of Defense. We also spoke to a lot of different DOJ prosecutors who were prosecuting cases of Americans who either joined IS or had returned. Also, the defense counsels for some of these individuals. You'd be surprised at how open some of them are if you reach out to them about their clients, as long as they have the permission to do so, and they shared a lot of information with us that they were. So a lot of researchers don't expect, but sometimes if you just ask, you'd be surprised at how much you can often get. And also, we had the chance, and this is kind of what adds. One of the problems of the general field of studying terrorism, radicalization, particularly jihadist terrorism, is access to people who are actually involved in the groups that you're researching. That's kind of often one of the big faults of what they call terrorism studies, the lack of that kind of access. So one of the things we try to do as much as we can, though it's still difficult, is interview actual members or former members of these groups. And we got a chance to interview a number of Americans who returned from Iraq and Syria, who are currently being held, who have either been convicted or facing trial. And we were able to have long discussions and interviews with them, which helped us both understand their motivations for joining, and also more technical questions on what they did when they were there, how they got there, who they met when they got there. And this helped us build this picture of these people. Also, analysis of a lot of different official documents, mostly court records, and also we use the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, in a number of cases to access previously sealed documents. Another good thing about doing this type of research in the United States compared to other parts of Europe is the general openness of the state compared to other Western nations. So getting court documents is much easier here, for example, than it is in England, where I used to live and do this research. And generally, accessing people like the FBI and other sort of official bodies, intelligence bodies, law enforcement bodies, is easier here, amazingly. Or people are often surprised to hear that, but they're much more open than, in my experience, other agencies like them or their counterparts in Europe. We also maintain a very large database of IS supporters' social media activity. And we were able to get a better understanding of how and why people traveled through creating a database of particularly Twitter activity of IS, English-speaking IS sympathizers, including some of whom we were able to identify through their handles as people who had actually traveled, and be able to build, again, a bigger picture of who they knew, who they spoke to before they went, when they were there. As far as the definition, as you noticed, the title of the report was, we call it the Travelers, American Jihadists in Iraq and Syria and Iraq. Often you hear the term foreign fighter. That's kind of the standard term you hear in the media for foreign terrorist fighter. What we tried to do with using the traveler term was to kind of get across that, yes, I mean, most people who go over there do so to fight, but there's a wider story here to why people join and travel to join groups like IS. And a lot of them genuinely did not go with the intention of, at least primarily, of fighting, but of rather being part of the wider state-building project of IS and the sort of utopian vision that it was supposedly carrying out. So we went with traveler because there were, in many cases, people with families who were going, women and children, who did not go with the intention of being involved in terrorism or guerrilla warfare, but again, with the wider idea of helping build this project, being part of this project. So that's why we went with that definition. It kind of offers that more holistic understanding of American and wider Western involvement with the group. As far as the motivations, why people joined, this is the kind of million-dollar question, is where it's often quite hard to understand that. And I think, I should caveat all of this with saying that there's very rarely a sort of really clear answer why someone decides to get involved in any type of political violence or any type of non-state violent group. There's a lot of different personal factors. There's a lot of serendipitous elements to it. They met the right person at the right time. They happened to live in an area where maybe they were charismatic recruiters. So there's a lot of things that are hard to completely identify. But having said all that, there were a few things that we did try to better understand. Often it's a cliche, but it's worth keeping in mind. There isn't a profile really of the individuals from our sample, at least that we saw. There was no single profile. Socioeconomically, really from any walk of life. Some well educated, some not. Some in good jobs, others not, and pretty much really across the board experiences. Motivations. So we have kind of 4 main categories here. And I'll go through those, and then I'll tell you a story about one of the people that we spoke to kind of give you a understanding of how kind of complicated it is. And often the people you speak to, interviewing someone who joins an extremist group, you don't just sit down with them and say, why did you join? Because they often they can't give you a completely clear and convincing answer to that. So there's you have to figure out better, more effective ways of speaking to people to better understand their motivations. Something you can get a better idea sometimes of why people leave a group. Sometimes those reasons are a little bit more straightforward or prosaic, but why people join, much harder. So often, on the sort of personal side, you have people who are experiencing what we hear about identity crises. In the case of jihadist groups, it's often second, third generation Muslims who, for one reason or other, and I'll give you one specific case in a second, don't feel part of the society that they are living in. And they're looking for another way to understand themselves, and groups like IS are able to present a fairly convincing picture for them about the kind of person that they could be instead. Sometimes it's much more basic than that. People looking for adventure, people looking for a sense of purpose. So in the case, sometimes you have cases of people, and I said, they do come from all walks of life, but one of the kind of standard stories you hear about are people who kind of had a lot of unrealized ambition in their lives, people who kind of think they should be in a better place in life than they really are stuck in jobs that they don't like, feel that they've been dealt a bad set of cards despite being deserving more. And groups like IS can offer you quite quickly that status and that respect that you could not really otherwise get in life. So all of a sudden, from having a sort of 9-to-5 job that's not fulfilling you, no one knows about you or hears about you, you can pretty much easily go and join a group that celebrates you hugely. You become part of their propaganda. You're presented as this kind of heroic figure. And really, that's kind of something that, in a number of cases, we did see a lot of appeal for. And the psychological is kind of the harder one, especially considering I'm not trained in that world. Is an area that we try not to. We acknowledge the importance of it in some cases, but we don't opine too much without having the expertise on the kind of psychological problems that some of the people who join have. Though one of the things that a lot of people like to dismiss or use to dismiss why people join, or rather be sort of offer a simplistic explanation, is that we often hear they're crazy or there's something wrong with them, they're mentally ill. The mental illness being apparently this major reason why people join extremist groups and particularly take part in terrorist violence. And I think that's a bit of a cop-out, because first off, mental illness alone cannot possibly be an explanation for partaking in violence. I mean, the vast majority of people who have mental illness are not violent. So assuming that there's just this causal connection between having mental illness and taking part in violence is a major misunderstanding of what mental illness is all about. And generally also most or all empirical research on the topic finds that in the vast majority of cases, people are not suffering from any kind of delusions or mental illness when they join extremist groups, or even when they take part in terrorist activity. But there are absolutely cases where that has a role to play. On the social element, I'll get into details about how we broke down. So we came up with a typology of the people who went to join. But the vast majority of the cases, these were people who had an involvement in a wider network of like-minded people. They were plugged into groups of friends or family who had similar ideas to them, and at least one of whom had a connection to a group like IS who could then help them join the group. So in most cases, in-person contact had a big role to play, particularly in parts of Minnesota. The biggest sort of proportion of people who went from one city was from Minnesota, and there's a very well-known network of extremists there who had a big role to play in that. And so that's a very important point, is that the groups that you're in heavily influencing your views and your decisions. There also often there's a religious element, sometimes more important than others. And this has to do largely with the belief in being part, like I said, I mentioned originally this utopian state project, and believing that for one reason or another coming to the conclusion that groups like Islamic State are the people who are properly practicing Islam, the belief that the establishment of Islamic law is the way to cure the world's problems. And actually, in a way, you can start to see, at least they believe, they look at their activities and their actions through an altruistic frame, even though it's hard to believe with groups that commit such atrocities like IS. They believe they're doing it for the betterment of the world. So if you understand that the mentality of a belief system which essentially says that, the biggest crime, in the view of any group that ascribes to, let's say, jihadist ideology, for them, the biggest crime on earth today is that people are living under laws other than those created by God. And that is what is keeping humanity from living truly free. Any law created by man, it cannot possibly be correct and cannot be right, because we have laws that have been set out by an omnipotent being. And the idea that anyone lives under any other law than that is, in their view, oppressive. And until the whole world lives under laws that have been developed by the perfect being, humanity will never be on the right path. And so once you start thinking like that, the ends start justifying the means. So you start thinking, well, yeah, we might have to wipe out this one certain group of people, but it's because we need to establish this utopia. So it starts to make a bit more sense. It might be the wrong way to put it, but it certainly starts to, in their view, justify a lot of the things they're doing. And they're seeing it through this frame of Islamic law for all being the only way to fix all the problems on earth. And in many cases, particularly early on when we saw the early stages of the Syrian conflict in particular, a lot of the people who went in the first wave to join various rebel groups in Syria, including the jihadist ones, they went as a reaction to the Syrian state's treatment of protesters in Syria. So when real crimes and atrocities were taking place against what began as a peaceful protest movement in Syria, a lot of people went to fight what they saw as this great injustice being done on Sunni Muslims against an Alawite government, rather by an Alawite government against Sunni Muslims. So for a lot of people early on, they went not really with an intention of this wider jihadist picture or establishing Islamic law or being part of IS, but rather just fight Assad, essentially. But in many cases, they went there and eventually went towards extremist groups. And that was, as I said, the first wave, where you could say there were options of who you would fight with. Now, of course, or in the last couple of years, if you travel to Syria to fight Assad, you'd almost only be fighting with a jihadist organization because of how that conflict has panned out. And often we hear a lot about the role of the internet. And I'll talk a bit about this more near the end, but there's this often a sort of desire to blame almost all of this on people's online activity. That people are, we hear a term, radicalized online, or online radicalization. You go online and you become a terrorist. And even when I put it like that, I think it might sound to you a little bit too simplistic or straightforward an assumption. And as I say there, we should understand the internet mostly as a tool rather than as a sort of something that completely changes an individual and their views and their personality. It's in the end, it's a mass communication tool that is being used by extremist groups, of course, to reach people that may not otherwise have reached with its propaganda. But the question is, if any of us today in the room went online and read IS propaganda, we're not going to become terrorists. That's just not enough of that's too much of a leap. So you have to think of other factors that are at play here. So often if you go online searching for that propaganda because of your involvement in, say, a group of people who have already started to socialize you into the jihadist environment and tell you that that message is correct and that that's the worldview that you should take on, then you go online and look for more information about it. Once you've already begun believing in the movement, then the internet can play a role. But you have to think about what sent that person online in the first place, usually. So it's very rare, though not completely unheard of, for people to be solely radicalized online. It's one of the very rare cases. On almost all the cases, the internet has a role to play, but these are individuals who had real-world connections and contacts that were heavily influencing their decisions. And whether or not, when you see a piece of information, how you regard it. Seeing jihadist propaganda for all of us today, we would see that as something that is against what we stand for, or is something that is offensive to us or dangerous. But that's because of the way we view that situation in that world. For someone else, it can be completely different. Though there is an element of the internet that has that is not just a communication tool. It's not just a one-way street. And that's something else you often hear about is social media. So people on places like Facebook, Twitter, and other social media platforms where you have more of it's not just communications, there are creations of networks of people who know each other and become linked together and are influenced by their involvement in an online network. So generally, before social media, the understanding of why someone became involved in an extremist group almost always had to do with their involvement in a physical network, as I mentioned, their involvement in a wider network of people. The question that still remains is, can the virtual online network replicate the same dynamics as the real world network, the face-to-face? And that's still a kind of open question. I think there are things that you can say about, say, Twitter that do help to replicate that environment. So if I was to tell you, in the days before the internet, social media, if you're an extremist recruiter, and you want to recruit someone, there's a way you generally do it. You identify someone who, for want of a better term, is vulnerable to your message, someone who you as the recruiter have identified as being a possible recruit. And then you take that individual and you seek to cut them off from their former life, or the things that are influencing them in their lives. So their friend group of the time, or their family group of the time, or their family, or any other kind of other groups of people that were influencing them. You cut them away from their former influences, and you put them in an echo chamber of individuals who are all saying the same thing, who are recycling the ideology of the group, who are not debating, who are not having any dissent, who are just having this kind of group think dynamic taking place. So you cut them away and you put them into a new network of people who share their views, and you close them away from everywhere else. So what I've just described to you is generally how it would work in the real world. And I've also just described to you sort of a version of how Twitter works. So if you go on Twitter and create a profile, the way Twitter works is it quite quickly figures out what your interests are, what you like, what you don't like, and it starts feeding you information based on what it thinks you want to hear and filtering out things you don't want to hear. So it helps create an echo chamber to some extent. And this is not just a nefarious thing. I mean, if you're a sports fan of a certain team, it's going to start telling you news about that team. It's not going to be putting you in touch with the rival team or anything like that. So, and any kind of subject. But if you are an extremist, it will figure out quite quickly the narratives you want to hear and will feed them to you. And also what Twitter does is it recommends other people who you should follow, and therefore helps you plug into a network of like-minded individuals. So it kind of replicates a lot of the different things that happen in the real world online, and that certainly has influenced people to some extent. So that is something that has kind of changed the game a little bit, and I'm happy to talk a bit more about that. In terms of kind of bringing some of this a bit more to life, just to talk about one of the interviews we did with a young man who had returned from Syria. He joined IS, and then after a while regretted his decision and handed himself in to the U.S. consulate in Turkey. He traveled back across the border from Syria to Turkey and handed himself in. He's now been He's now pled guilty to joining a prescribed terrorist group, providing material support, and he's awaiting sentencing. And we spoke to him for a couple of hours about his whole story, from how he got involved to why he left. And of course, we ended being very well informed about it, but not having a complete picture of why he did join. And of course, he himself was not able to completely understand that. But let's tell you a little bit about how that started for him. And it touches on a number of the things that I've just mentioned. So he was a secular. He was born to a Muslim family, but not really interested in his religion. And he was actually going to Columbia University, so pretty smart. And he was doing classes in political science. And in one class, the professor screened a movie called Submission, which I don't know if anyone here knows about. It's a fairly, in Europe, very controversial film by a Dutch filmmaker called Theo van Gogh, who you may know, who was killed in the end in a terrorist attack in Amsterdam. The film essentially was quite a large criticism of Islam. It was a film that depicted a woman in an Islamic dress, but that was also kind of transparent and quite, in a way that was designed to sort of stoke up. It was designed to kind of create a discussion around Islam and conservative values and all that in Europe. But it did have the result, or it had the effect of offending a lot of Muslims in Europe anyway. It was seen as this kind of attack on Islam. And it became a real touch point of the story of Islam in Europe in general. And in the end, the filmmaker was killed by a jihadist who was so offended that he thought he had to behead the man in the streets of Amsterdam. Anyway, the film was shown in this class because of its importance to that story of Islam in Europe. And he identified as Muslim, as I said, but wasn't very religious. And he was very shaken by the footage, by the film. And he said to us how it was a moment that it was a bit of a catalyst for him. It kind of was a religious, political awakening. He was surprised, one, by just how a film like that could be made in the West. He saw that as essentially pushing, in his view, going too far and exploiting freedom of speech to attack a religion. He was also surprised at the reaction of his classmates. He said that he seemed to be the only one who was shocked or offended, and no one really seemed to mind or be too offended. And it sort of made as he explained it, it forced him. He wanted to stand up and say something about it and complain about it or argue about it, but he didn't feel he was equipped intellectually or religiously, theologically to do that. So it kind of sparked in him this desire to go back and start researching his religion, start understanding the political element of the sort of Islam in the West question, and look at who was doing what about this. So, and this kind of touches a bit more on the psychological element, and this is again where our expertise was a bit limited, but we certainly could notice. He said that he'd actually experienced a major personal tragedy in his life. A couple years before that, his sister had died while in childbirth, and she and the baby died in hospital. A majorly traumatic event, which is often part of the story of why someone joins an extremist group. Hugely traumatic event for him and his family. And he said in passing, is sort of as if it wasn't that relevant, that the woman in the film who was wearing the Islamic dress reminded him of his sister. And he kind of moved on. And I just thought, I wondered, it was not for me at that point to analyze that any further, but it certainly was something to think about how these things can affect, how they link together, how the personal traumas and experiences, and then your sort of experiences after that, how they can link together and how they can influence, wider decisions. So he went back and started researching Islam, and this was right at the time, and of course the other question is serendipity here. This happened right at the time that the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria was becoming big and was reaching out to Westerners, particularly Westerners who were having these exact same questions of identity and the question of where does Islam fit in the West and where do I fit? And so the timing of all of that happening together happened to coincide with IS reaching out to Westerners. So as he started looking at his religion, he started seeing this group that kept appealing to him and saying, we're the ones who are properly implementing Islam. We're the ones who are defending Muslims from this war on Islam that's taking place. We are establishing true Islamic law, and we need people to come and help us join. And this eventually is what he bought into. And according to him, and everything you hear from people who are facing sentencing and who are being convicted of terrorist offenses, you have to take it with a pinch of salt. You have to think, of course, there are reasons why he would want to downplay different things he did. And he said that he never intended to travel there to fight. He said, I wanted to go there and just be part of the project. I wasn't a fighter. I didn't consider myself a fighter. I wanted to go and just start a family there and just be part of this new thing. I didn't feel I had a place anymore in America. Whether or not that's true, you have to, as I said, not just take everything people in those situations say at face value, but it certainly made sense. And when he went there, he eventually realized that he was going to be forced not just to fight, but be put on the front line and almost definitely die. And in a period, quite quickly after joining, he started making a lot of effort to get back. He actually reached out to the FBI, told them he wanted to return, requesting full immunity if he did. He wanted to essentially be sort of airlifted out and then be kind of given a clean slate, which was probably asking a bit much. And actually the FBI told him, we're not going to help you until you come back to any U.S. embassy or consulate. So they did leave him out in the cold until he managed to come back. And once he handed himself over, he was flown back. And he cooperated a lot with the authorities. He gave them full details on where he was, where these certain camps were, and I think assisted hugely in the effort to fight IS as far as knowing who was where at the time. And this, of course, will influence eventually his sentencing, I'm sure. That's just one story in terms of giving you the kind of complexity that can be involved. And of course, the internet played a role for him there. His research was done largely online, which is probably not the best place to start asking all those kind of complex questions. And he was in touch with extremists online who helped direct him in certain, push him in certain directions. So that's just a short version of that story that kind of helps to a little bit explain, but also show you the difficulties in totally understanding those motivations. And this is actually it's a bit blurry. I don't know if you can completely see it. But this is a letter we recovered from Mosul in Iraq, actually. This is exclusively in our report, is now part of the investigation. There's an American whose status we don't currently know, who traveled to join IS a couple years ago, called Warren Clark. And we knew someone who lived in Iraq who had a house in Mosul. And Mosul, you might remember, was under ISIS control for some time, up until recently. And it used a lot of, one of the things that ISIS has done that it's famous for is creating this very large bureaucracy. It's keeping records of everyone who joined. When you join IS, and one of the things we found out from the people who went, is you sign forms, you fill in forms as if you would any normal job. You tell them your skills and what you think you can do and what your past work experience was. It's bureaucratized this entire operation. So it used houses in Mosul for keeping all these documents together. So, and one of the houses that they ended up using was a house of someone we knew. And when ISIS were kicked out of Mosul by Iraqi forces, she went back to her home and recovered a number of documents that ISIS had left behind and shared them with us, including this one, which is part of a CV by Warren Clark, who was using the name Abu Muhammad al-Amriki. And just to read the top bit for you there, he says, I am looking to get a position teaching English to students in the Islamic State. I was born and raised in the United States and have always loved teaching others and learning from others, etc. I believe that a successful teacher can understand students' strength. And so this is, really a normal cover letter for a CV and a normal application for a job. And this tells you a couple of things. Firstly, as far as the motivations go again, why we didn't go with the word fighter in all cases. Now, as far as we know, when he eventually did join, he did become involved in fighting. But as far as his initial motivations and what we can see, they weren't just about, I want to go and be violent and kill people and fight. It's, I want to be part of that wider project, including teaching English at an Islamic school to young Iraqi or Syrian students. So this document, once we recovered it, we had to share with the authorities as well, and is now part of the investigation into Warren Clark. But that's just a small example, again, of the different elements of why people join, the different shades of person who join. Just some statistics for you as far as those 64 individuals that we identified. Average age, you can see there, 27, so it kind of still fits in that range of the ages that people generally do get involved in political violence. A kind of 18 to 30 range is almost always the case. 16 different states of origin. Vast majority are men. Also, vast majority were U.S. citizens or permanent residents. Some of the states with the highest rates of travel, people who ended up traveling, Minnesota, Virginia, and Ohio. The vast majority also went to join IS. And then we have a breakdown there on the right of the kind of status right now. You can see a number of them are confirmed dead, 34%. A small number have returned to the U.S. without facing charges, which is an interesting group. 19% are in custody now. That's 12 altogether, who are apprehended rather in the U.S. and overseas. And 44% are the ones to be, I think, most concerned about, which are the ones we've identified as having traveled, but whose status is now unknown, at least to us in the public. Now, this may not be the case. There may be people in the CIA, the FBI, who do know the status of these people, but the ones who are obviously at large, who aren't dead, are the ones who are, of course, of most concern. Now, I'd imagine that a significant chunk of them are actually dead, and we just haven't been able to confirm it. But as far as the next issue, the next threat, as it were, when the next kind of jihadist fight takes place somewhere in the world, these are the kind of individuals who are going to want to be involved and who will move on to the next battlefield. And also the kind of individuals who may be involved in setting up recruitment networks, reaching back to where they're based in the United States virtually, and helping set up recruitment networks and radicalization networks in the U.S. using their connections. And having been in Syria or Iraq and fighting gives you a lot of credibility to the people who are over here who are interested in the group, and they would be looking up to individuals like that, and they could be very effective at helping other people join, or at encouraging other people to join. At the bottom there, 75% of the 12 in total who've returned to the U.S. Were arrested and charged. So 12, by the way, of these 64 have returned. So not a huge number. And again, there may be individuals that we don't know about who've returned, but it's not going to be, I don't believe, a huge amount more. So as far as the scale and the nature of this issue here, it's nothing compared to Europe. In Europe, you have proportionally huge amounts more people going and many more coming back. And if you notice, the kind of recent terror attacks that have been linked to IS or jihadist groups more widely in the United States, if you were to look at the Orlando nightclub shooting or the San Bernardino shootings, or even the Fort Hood mass shooting by Major Nidal Hassan, all the attack, or the recent Manhattan truck ramming, all of these attacks have involved individuals who did not travel to any groups, who were based in the U.S. and didn't receive any training or direction, at least not in face-to-face interactions with any sort of terrorist organization. That's actually the exception to the rule as far as Western countries go. If you look in Europe, if you think of the attacks in Paris a couple of years ago, the Bataclan and the other related attacks there, the bombings in the Brussels airport and the metro, the bombing in the Manchester Arena in the UK, the ones that have claimed a lot of lives and have been quite sophisticated, all involved individuals who had traveled to join groups like this and come back, either had received training and came back. So the US is an outlier in that sense, that actually the threat is almost exclusively right now what we call homegrown, or people who are based here. Who weren't sent here or anything like that. That can change, so I wouldn't want to say that means that none of these people who traveled are a threat. And we know of one individual who came back, of those 12, who came back with the instructions to carry out an attack, but who was stopped early on. So that's might be surprising to hear for some, considering the way that this issue is often covered, that the real threat is people who are returning, as it were, from the battlefield here. But right now, that's not at all the case. When we identified these 64 people who traveled, one of the things we wanted to do to try and better understand both why and how they joined and offer a better and more nuanced understanding of that is we developed a new typology for them, and we came up with 3 categories. Probably the most important but the least populated category is that top one, the pioneers. Generally, these are individuals who arrived in Syria or Iraq quite early. They are people who got into more senior leadership positions in Islamic State or in other jihadist groups there. The reasons for that usually have to do with them having more experience than the average recruit, either previous military experience, previous experience in other jihadist groups from other parts of the world, or having technical skills, be that IT skills, computer skills, be that strong religious or ideological knowledge, the ability to impart that, to train other people in an ideology and religion, the ability to produce propaganda and to know how to disseminate it. These are the kind of things that if you join a group like IS and you have in your drawer, as it were, you'll have a chance of rising the ranks. One case of a pioneer, and this makes up something like 6% of the 64 that we identified. So it's the smallest of the 3 categories, but it's probably the most important for a number of reasons. One, because these are the ones who are likely to once, say, IS, as we know now, is struggling. It hasn't maintained any of its territory. It's sort of somewhat on the back foot, though it's still a very effective insurgency group. They're the ones who are going to keep the fight going, who are also going to, when IS, say, moves to another country, or when the next big fight happens for a jihadist insurgency, they're the ones who can maintain a connection to their home country, as I mentioned before, and keep recruiting people, say, from America in this case. They're the ones who can serve as that connection to new battlefields that can otherwise, be severed quite easily. One guy that we identified, French-born but grew up in Massachusetts, Ahmed Abu Samra, who for years and years was trying to join different jihadist groups in Yemen, I think at one point, in Pakistan, in Iraq. But every time he tried to join, he was actually turned away because he didn't have enough either experience, also because he didn't have anyone who was vouching for him to these groups, so he wasn't really trusted. He finally managed in this time to join IS and became, having a very deep knowledge of the theology and ideology that drives IS, became one of the main teachers of ideology to new recruits. He also started creating a lot of their propaganda. That picture is from him on the cover of a magazine that IS produced called Rumiyah. It's done in a number of languages, including English, and it's kind of an online magazine that's used to spread propaganda. He essentially helped set that up, and also another magazine similar called Dabik, which he wrote a lot of. So he was a key kind of propagandist for them. He eventually died on the battlefield. And there's a number of other individuals like him, some of them actually more battle-hardened and experienced. But as I said, that's the smallest category, about 6%. Something like 80% of the sample came from what we call the networked travelers category. And this is what I mentioned to you before, the importance of being involved in wider networks. These individuals who used pre-existing family or personal other type of personal connections to help them travel to join IS. Often we see that a lot of the people, the Americans who joined, are linked to each other one way or another through kind of connections that they have. And there are different ways that happens. As I mentioned, sometimes it's family, sometimes it's friends, other times it's your local community. And as I said, Minnesota is probably the biggest example of that. Something like 14 or so have traveled from there, all of whom I could show you a chart that would show you that almost all of them are connected, either through family or friends. So that's a very, very important part of this. And one of the examples that I have there is the Kodamaiti family, who were living in the United States for some time, Syrian originally, who moved back to Aleppo in Syria during the conflict, and ended up helping jihadist groups in Aleppo fight against Assad, and then attempting to travel back here, not with, as far as we know, with any intention to carry out attacks, who were then arrested. These were father and two sons, so you have to think of the importance of the influence of your family members in helping influence your decision to join or motivate you. The last, and that's, like I said, about 80% of the sample had some sort of networked in-person or personal connections to either like-minded individuals or actual members of IS. The third category are what we call the loners, and these are, again, that exception to the rule that I mentioned to you, those people who joined IS without any obvious connection to anyone, who did seem to be mostly motivated or influenced by their online activity. And also who traveled at least right to the border of Syria without any assistance or advice from anyone. No known personal connections to jihadists, and instead developing online connections. And because of the way that IS has been operating, these guys were able to, once they got to Syria, or once they got to Turkey rather, which was a pretty easy flight from here, but wasn't at the time, especially early on, arising any suspicion, they would then contact individuals through a number of different online platforms, who would then give them, who were based in Syria or Iraq, who would give them advice and put them in touch with people smugglers or other individuals who would help them cross the border. And one case was a Virginia resident, Mohammed Qais, was convicted of just, I think, 20 years recently when he returned. He was actually ended up being captured by Kurdish forces in northern Iraq last year. You may remember the story of an American who was arrested in northern Iraq by Kurdish fighters and ended up being handed over to U.S. custody. As far as we know, his journey to Syria was unaided until he reached the border, where he reached out to people through encrypted online platforms who helped him cross over. And he used all sorts of different technology to hide his identity, to hide his movements, and to hide his communications. And he did this all very effectively. And in fact, as far as we know, when he was arrested by Kurdish authorities, that was the first time that anyone in law enforcement or in the intelligence community knew about him. So he had gone there without anyone knowing. He wasn't known there. He wasn't known to be there. And the first time that name came up was when he was arrested, which shows that that's rare, but also shows that the guys who are the loners are the ones who are the hardest to track and know about, because they have no connections to anyone. There's no reason to be suspicious of them. But again, they make only something like, it was about 8% of the full sample. And again, though I did downplay the importance of the internet, without their ability to communicate online, that category probably wouldn't exist, I would say. Some statistics here on the returnee question, which I've kind of talked about a little bit already. And this is this issue of what's the threat to us, or as it were, domestically. What terrorist threat do they pose? As I said, 12 of the sample returned to the U.S. 9 of them were arrested and charged. None have carried out an attack. And as I also said, since 2011, which is kind of when the Syrian conflict started, there have been 22 attacks in the U.S., large and small. As I mentioned, none of them were carried out by people who returned from IS territory. One individual, a guy called Abdurrahman Sheikh Mohammed, did return to the U.S. He was actually a member of Jabhat al-Nusra, which is an al-Qaeda-aligned jihadist group in Syria. He was sent back here with express instructions from a leadership figure there to carry out an attack here. He was scoping out a military prison in Texas that he was planning on attacking. And actually, as far as we know, he was originally came under suspicion because his brother, and again, when we talk about those network connections, family connections, his brother had joined IS or Jabhat al-Nusra a few months earlier than him. And so he went and joined his brother out there, and it was sent back. His brother was known to the authorities and was on a list of people who were of interest to law enforcement. And when he got back home, he was pulled over by it was a routine traffic stop. And I'm not sure accidentally or not, he used his brother's driver's license when the police officer asked him for his license registration, and he used his brother's one, and that raised a flag, and that's eventually how he was identified. So those little stories that you don't otherwise hear about. And yeah, so whether or not, again, there's questions with a lot of this research that are very hard to answer. Whether or not he returned from Iraq or rather from Syria without the knowledge at all of authorities is not entirely clear to us. If he did, that's a very rare case for people to come back here totally unknown. It's a very difficult thing to do, both because of the geographic distance and because of the network of informants and the general work that's being done here makes that really a really tough thing to do. Something related to this issue is, in that second to last bullet point, is that a number of cases we saw people who they tried to travel but failed to do so and kind of planned an attack as a backup option. They kind of their desire to travel was sort of dashed, or their hopes were dashed. And so their fallback was an attack. So it wasn't the initial motivation. And I think a lot of people who did plan attacks in the name of IS here, if they were given the option to be able to travel to join, they probably would have taken that instead. The primary goal for them is not necessarily terrorist attacks. They absolutely support it. But again, it's being part of that project. As I said there at the bottom, though, the law enforcement, generally intelligence community, criminal justice system, they've done a very good job of monitoring, detecting, and prosecuting these returnees. Just some final thoughts. As I mentioned, 8 returned travelers have been convicted or pled guilty. 7 so far have received prison sentences. The one who's still waiting on that is the individual we actually spoke to. He's likely to get a lenient sentence because of how much he's cooperated. One of the other interesting kind of things that have come up is that the people who have returned so far in their sentences are getting an average of 10 years in jail. Though the people who tried to join and were convicted of material support or attempting to provide material support, who didn't successfully join, who were stopped, are getting 14 years on average. So it's a strange 4-year discrepancy. You'd imagine that someone who actually joined a jihadist group, a prescribed terrorist group, and came back would be facing much bigger charges, or at least would be facing a bigger prison sentence. But actually the people who tried and didn't manage it got larger ones. And there's actually 2 reasons why that is. I don't know if anyone has a guess why that might be.
Dissolution.
Say again?
Dissolution.
Yeah, but why would they get a smaller, why would someone who came back, who joined and came back, why would they get a smaller prison sentence? Informants. Right, so that's exactly one of the reasons. One is they provide a lot of information in return for getting a smaller sentence. Another one is that the evidence is actually very hard to gather. When someone goes to Syria, it's very hard to prove why they did and what they did when they were there. The fog of war, as it were, means that evidence gathering is tough, and so it's often quite difficult to prove. Often they have to look at what they were saying and doing in their emails or something like that to kind of get an idea of their motivations, but that's another big reason. As far as what to do with it, I'll be very quick on this. As I said already, the main threat really remains in terms of the terrorist threat here is a homegrown one. At the moment, there isn't really a strategy for dealing with the people who are returning. It's being done on an ad hoc kind of case-by-case basis. On the whole, prosecution is the way that they're dealing with it, which is completely understandable and makes sense. But as far as how to deal with them longer term, we kind of recommend that there's a number of different things that should be assessed when dealing with these returnees, and that has to do with how much they were engaged with these extremist groups when they were there, if you can have the evidence, and the kind of different levels, as it were, of engagement, and a way of assessing the threat that they pose when they come back, and helping kind of categorize them on the basis of how and why they went, what they did there. At the moment, it's not quite, as far as we know, that's not the situation. How you respond to them, because if you imagine there are children who will be coming back. There are people who are more coerced than others into going. And so treating them all the same would arguably not be the most effective way to do it. So things like their age, their background, their connections or lack thereof to other jihadists, what they did before they joined, what they did when they were there. And those kind of things might help us better develop more kind of, I suppose, wide-ranging ways of dealing with them. The categories that I mentioned, the pioneer, the network trap, and the loner might help in this regard. So if you're a pioneer, if you're someone who's got all sorts of connections to different jihadist groups, veteran of conflicts, you probably pose a much bigger threat than, say, the loner who went without any knowledge of what was going on, or without a huge amount of knowledge, who went and became disillusioned and came back. Those are two very different categories of person, and how you deal with them may have to depend on what kind of category you could place them in. Imprisonment, as I said, limited, but crucial, but limited. The sentences are short. So as I mentioned to you, average sentence, 14 years. That's not a huge amount of time, though most of them serve all their sentences. But we have to think about what's happening to them when they're in prison. Because in Europe, major incubator of extremist networks and groups and radicalization is happening in prisons. Among the people that you're imprisoning for these kind of offenses, they go in there and they influence a lot of other people. And then, one jihadist comes in, 50 can come out. At present, there are in the U.S. prison system, there's no rehab programs for jihadists. So you go in for drugs or alcohol or any type of other problems, there are programs there in place trying to rehabilitate you. Those don't exist for jihadist IS-related prisoners, and that's something that we recommend, and which the prison system is looking at. It doesn't exist right now. Also, outside of prison, not a huge amount of programs dealing with steering people away from the path of extremism or getting them to kind of change their mindset. Sometimes those returning fighters may be useful to deploy in these cases. So you might be able to use someone who joined IS, came back because they were disillusioned. They're going to have a lot more credibility, and they can be used to speak to young people who are thinking of joining, who are seen as vulnerable, and they can maybe listen to them when they wouldn't listen to, say, their parents or FBI or someone else. So that can be used, and that has been used at times. Online, in terms of addressing the threat, one of the big temptations is censorship, right? That we should just remove this stuff from the internet. Propaganda, we should just block access to it. It's one of the main things that the governments generally in the West want to see more of. They want to see tech companies taking stuff off their platforms, which is certainly should be part of the solution. But in the end, the nature of the internet means that it's almost impossible to completely remove access to this stuff. Another big problem that exists is the spreading of technology that allows you to have encrypted conversations. So conversations that cannot be read by the state, that cannot be intercepted by agencies like the NSA or others in the rest of the West. So people who are planning attacks using these messengers, and people who are helping people travel using these encrypted messengers is a big issue that is going to really be one of the main, I think, points of debate between the state and tech companies going forward. The state is going to want more access to encrypted conversations. The companies on the whole are pushing back against that, and there's a couple of reasons why. The most famous platform right now that allows for encrypted communication is something called Telegram. And Telegram right now has claimed that it has refused at any point to give a single byte of information to a state. So they refuse to share any information with any government, be it a Western one or any other. And they have a couple of arguments that make sense. One is, in the end, these encrypted communication platforms are not just used by the bad guys. They're used by, say, dissidents in authoritarian states to communicate with each other and organize protests, organize activism. There are people who, liberal Democrats, as it were, who are using this to survive. And if we start allowing states access to these, it's the thin end of the wedge. And next thing you know, when the U.S. asks for, sort of terrorist communication. Next thing, Russia will be asking for what they call terrorist communication, and what Putin defines as a terrorist can range from someone protester in Moscow to a member of IS. So it opens up a big can of worms. So their current position is to not allow states any access to any of this. I'll leave it at that to leave time for questions. But thank you.
Thank you. I'm a retired high school history teacher from Long Island, a very good district, and I had a student in an AP class who was totally alienated from the other students. No one would work with him, no one would talk to him. He could discourse in the New York Times every day, but he didn't do his work. So I think you might want to characterize him as a loner, definitely, I think, suffering from depression. Called his parents all the time. Rarely would I get a call back. Very affluent family. The home was in excess of $1 million. Anyway, by the time he graduated from high school, which would make him 18 or 19, and I'm not going to say his name publicly, he apparently online had made plans to go to Yemen. And he was arrested after he had purchased the ticket, I guess on the way to the airport, and they said he was facing 30 years. I thought that was a little steep for someone who hadn't, physically left the country yet. I mean, he did have the ticket in hand, but does that seem, and this was on the national news. So,
yeah, I could probably guess who you're talking about, but
I'll say his name later.
So your question is was that a fair? Was your question was that a fair sentence that he got, or?
Well, I was just kind of shocked because knowing him personally, and teachers always say, well, I could tell you the first day.
Yeah.
I couldn't tell you the first day, but this kid was totally alienated. I mean, talk about a loner and filling the so-called, descriptor. There he was. I mean, not a friend in the world.
Yeah, and he may well have found that community of support online. And like I said, what the recruiters are effective at doing is being able to identify people who are in those positions and offering them something that can fulfill them. Both that kind, there's a lot of camaraderie and brotherhood that is on offer here too. Joining these groups, a big part of their propaganda is come and be with the brothers, and you can live like a bunch of friends and family, and everyone loves each other and helps each other. That can be really appealing. So I without knowing details of that case, I'd imagine 30 years is a lot. I think there's a number of cases where, as I said, the people who attempted to join do get higher sentences. And it may, the sentencing may depend on maybe he refused to cooperate, or that may have something to do with it, his how he reacted to the arrest or the charging. Hard to say, but yeah, it's a life-destroying decision that a lot of these people are making. So one of the things that people are calling for is some programs that identify people like that and try and intervene before they make that life-destroying decision. But there are controversies around doing that kind of thing. But actually, people in positions like yourself, teachers, community workers, what they call frontline, people who are the ones who can identify those people. Sometimes there are programs in Europe, for example, that would have encouraged you, for example, to go to the government. But I probably don't have to explain why that is also something people see with suspicion, is asking teachers to report on their students, particularly if it has to do with religion and race or anything. So it's a very difficult question. But
well, I had him in 9th grade, and the curriculum in New York State, the college, the AP course, you're talking about ancient history, so he had an interest in that, but he didn't show any of the radical tendencies.
Right. So.
But as I said, I would call, because it was an AP course, I would speak to his mother or leave a message and not have the phone call returned at least once a week, and nothing. Now, he was also in an AP psychology course. That teacher just pushed him out. I let him stay to the end of the year because he was such a sad soul. And he got maybe, with the grace of God, a 65. But he didn't get a lot of compassion from anyone.
How many interviews did you conduct?
In total, with all the different categories I mentioned, it would be somewhere in the kind of 24 range.
Did you get a feeling of how many would rejoin if the opportunity presented itself?
As far as the people we joined, who we interviewed, who had returned, no. And you have to imagine that, again, the context in which they were being spoken to was, under the watchful eye of the FBI agents who were tasked with dealing with them and the prosecutors, and so they would, even if they had intended to, they wouldn't have said anything. But from what we could see, there was a genuine regret and a realization that they had joined a group that wasn't what they thought it was, and were shocked at what they were asked to do and what they were doing once they got there. But again, they had reasons to be saying that.
I understand ISIS is somewhat of a sui generis type of situation, but we've seen things that are akin to this before. In terms of adventurism, prior to our entry into both World War I and World War II, we had Americans that went over, fought with the British, joined the Canadian Air Force, things like that. In the 30s, we had people that fought in Spain for a cause. And in the anti-societal behavior, we've had things like Marlon Brando, the motorcycle gangs, we've had the Sharks and the Jets, we've had the LA street gangs, things like that. And I was wondering if any of the research that's been done into those phenomenon has triggered or is interfaces with anything you're doing. And then my second question, a little bit separate, is the success seemed to breed success for ISIS. When they looked invincible and we saw all these pictures of them doing these horrible things and they were expanding, they seemed to attract more people. Now that they are being pushed back and virtually driven out of the caliphate and all that, has that, or will that continue to dampen the recruitment efforts?
Yeah, so the first question is, it's a good one. There is, of course, been a lot of research before the jihadist movement came after 9/11, for example, on why people join different types of groups, both politically violent groups, cults, gangs. I have to say, I haven't seen too much on looking at why people say join the Spanish Civil War. I don't know if there's much academic work on that, but it's an analogy that's often made, and I think it's in the sense of the motivation to be part of a fight that's taking place outside of your own country certainly has to be taken into account. And actually, some people sometimes describe joining a terrorist group akin to joining the military of your country, and this is an analogy people obviously say carefully, but the sense of identifying with a certain group of people and wanting to join the military of that group. And the cases of the people who are joining IS, in their view, they are primarily, Muslim, and that's their nation, is the nation of fellow worshippers. And for them, the military of that group that's defending them is IS. So the motivation for joining, say, a national military and joining IS can maybe sometimes overlap. But again, there hasn't been a huge amount of academic research on that. But on the gang, criminality side, I think there's an overlap, something which, of course, we consider, which is that belonging question in particular, being part of a group of people, getting something that perhaps you never got at home. They see father figures in the gang members who recruit them, and certainly there's that overlap. But I guess the thing that's usually lacking in that comparison is the ideological component. I mean, there's not generally though I think there is, we can say there's some gangs who do have wider ideologies, but generally people are not joining for some world-changing, ideological movement, but it's generally a financial, driven incentives. But it is something that we certainly take into account. On the other question, which is about how IS going to still appeal to people, I think is generally what. And I think this is a question we get a lot, which is now that they had this caliphate that drew a lot of people in because the kind of narrative of it being established after so long again was very attractive. Now that it's gone, where is its attraction? Well, one thing to take into account is people were joining Al-Qaeda before there was any caliphate. They were still able to recruit people, largely using the message of the lost caliphate, the romanticized idea of wanting to reestablish it. Once IS came and actually established it, that helped them. That partly explains that they were able to recruit more people, because they were able to say, we're not just talking about some theoretical thing that may or may not happen, not in your lifetime. We've done it now. I think for a lot of people who maybe were on the fence about, should I risk my life for something I'm probably never going to see happen, that helped them jump over and say, okay, well, they've done it. This is worth fighting and dying for. Now that it's gone, they are, you know, if you can imagine, Al-Qaeda could use the idea of a caliphate from so long ago as still something that could draw people. Now they've just had it. So it's kind of renewed that romanticism of the lost caliphate in a way. It's re-upped it so they can now, the message can be, well, we just had it, we've lost it, but it was in your lifetime, it's even more possible to see it again. So I think they can still use that. But it certainly will impact their ability to recruit, but it's not going to make it go away.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Since I have the mic here,
Yeah.
I do have a question, no, a comment. We use the word romance a lot, and you know, from the Spanish War to the caliphates, romance seems to be a really important
Yeah.
important feature.
Absolutely, yeah,
Yeah.
very much so. It's emotion.
No.
Don't forget the power of emotion.
Yes, yeah. Well, thank you. It was very good to know as much about this, to be somewhat relieved that there isn't too much of it going on, but it's very helpful. Thank you very much. Yeah. And don't forget, 2 weeks from today, David Myers and Hussein Yabish will be here. Don't forget. Thank you.
Thanks. Just gonna get my.
Yes, yeah.